Hello. Today I'm going to be discussing how one critiques an academic journal article. So when we critique academic literature, it's not good enough just to say that we don't like the study or, this person's a jerk or whatever. We critique it by looking at the methods that were used in the article and really kind of digging deep into how the study was done and identifying some methodological problems that exist in the study. Now, I should just mention here that no study is perfect, and every study, I don't care who did it, there is going to be a problem somewhere. All right, there's some kind of flaw, there's some kind of limitation, and limitations in and of themselves are not necessarily bad. Sometimes a study limitation can actually open the door for new research. So, for example, someone might do a study looking at, let's say, a rehabilitation program that targets juvenile offenders, and they only have juveniles in the sample. Could be a good study, but we don't know if this program is going to work on adult offenders. So that would be a limitation that someone could point out, and then someone could do a study using adult offenders and then see if, in fact, the program works with adult offenders as well. So sometimes limitations open the door for more research. But anyway, there's a number of ways that you can critique an academic article, and I'm just going to briefly go over some of these to give you some ideas and some starting points. So three basic ways that you could do it would be, first, to consider whether or not the article addressed all the points for nomothetic causality. And nomothetic causality is discussed in detail in Chapter 4, so if you don't remember nomothetic causality, take a look at Chapter 4 of Maxfield and Babby. You can consider also the threats to validity, and validity threats are covered in depth in chapters 4, 5, and 7. And then finally, you can consider the data collection methodology that the researchers used and the weaknesses that are associated with the particular methodology. And so methodological data collection strategies as well as weaknesses are discussed in chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. So just to go into a little bit more detail, again, I'm not going to go in depth with each of these, but I just want to give you some general guidance here. So remember, there were three criteria for nomothetic explanations and nomothetic causality. So the independent dependent variable must covary, the cause has to occur in time before the effect, and the correlation between the cause and the effect is not due to some other factor or confounding. Okay, and this is all discussed in Chapter 4. So one way that you can critique a study is you can ask if the researchers addressed all three of these criteria. Because remember, a lot of academic research is trying to show and model this relationship between an independent and a dependent variable, or multiple independent variables and a dependent variable. And weaknesses would be if they didn't address all 3 points. Most criminology and criminal justice research really only addresses the first point, the correlation between the independent and dependent variable. But I've talked about before how we have problems demonstrating that time order exists, that the cause really occurred in time before the effect, right? So what came first, drug use or crime? All right, we have a hard time demonstrating that. And also we have a hard time demonstrating this last criterion, that the relationship that we see between the independent and dependent variable is not due to some outside factor. All right, so unless your study is some kind of a longitudinal study or is an experiment, they're probably going to do a poor job demonstrating point 2 and point 3 with respect to nomothetic causality. So that could be something that you could mention when you write up your article critique. Okay, and again, this isn't going to apply to every study. This is where your knowledge of methods comes in, and where it's so important, because you need to understand how each of these factors play into your study and whether or not they'll be relevant. All right. So some other things you can consider in critiquing a study are validity threats. And there are four basic families of validity threats. So internal validity, which is discussed in chapters 4 and 7. External validity, which is also discussed in chapters 4 and 7. Statistical conclusion validity, which is also discussed in chapters 4 and 7. And finally, measurement validity, which is sort of an umbrella term that I'm using for the different families of measurement validity threats that are discussed in chapter 5. So I'm not going to go through all of these in depth. I'll leave that up to you. But chapter 7 literally presents a laundry list of internal validity threats. And most of these have to do with experiments, but there are some that probably would work in other contexts. Again, this is where your knowledge of methods is going to become important, because you'll want to assess your study and see if each of these threats apply. Some of them will, some will not. Okay, so you have to consider each of these threats and whether or not they'll apply. A lot won't. For example, diffusion or imitation of treatments probably won't apply unless you're looking at an experiment that had a treatment control group and interactions among the folks in those groups. Same deal with compensatory treatment, compensatory rivalry, and demoralization. Most of these only have to do with experiments. Okay, so again, it's going to be up to you to figure out which of these threats apply to your study. External validity, this has to do with the generalizability of your study. And this is a great way to, really critique any study. So, okay, we have these incredible, amazing findings showing that hotspots policing reduces violent crime in Orlando. Great. Is this generalizable to other areas? Will hotspots policing work in New York? Will it work in Winter Park, Florida? Will it work in St. Louis? Okay, so you can attack a study by looking at the generalizability. How generalizable are these findings to other contexts? Another way that you can critique a study is to consider statistical conclusion validity. And statistical conclusion validity threats all have to do with sample size and the ability to have adequate statistical power. So what do we know about sample sizes, right? If a sample is too small, then the possibility exists that we might only be able to detect large cause and effect relationships. All right. On the other hand, if our sample is too large, then we'll detect all kinds of cause and effect relationships and independent, dependent variable relationships, but they may not necessarily be true. They may not have significance. They'll have statistical significance, but they may not have substantive significance. So again, you have to keep in mind sample size with respect to statistical conclusion validity. And then finally, we can assess measurement validity, and this is all discussed in Chapter 5. Again, I'll leave it up to you to go through this, but when you look at your study, think about the measures. Think about how they measure different concepts in their study, and do these measures have face validity, criterion-related validity, construct validity, and content validity? So these are some areas that you can consider. And then finally, you can consider the data collection strategies that were used to collect data for your particular study. And so we talked about all of these strategies in prior chapters, and the fact that all of these strategies have their individual strengths and weaknesses. So for example, on surveys, we know that if we do self-report surveys where we ask people to self-report their own drug use, a lot of times people lie. They're not honest. So this would be a weakness anytime you do survey research that relies on people to be honest and tell us how they feel or what they've done. Qualitative research, field research, this depends a lot on observation and interpretation of things that people say or that we see in the field. And interpretation can be very subjective. Agency records, content analysis, secondary data. Agency records a lot of times are not collected for research purposes, right? We have the problem of social production of data, okay, that we're relying on CJ officials to collect our data. Content analysis, this relies on interpretation. And so we have problems, just like we see with field research, that interpretations of things that we see in content analysis can be very subjective. Secondary data, if we use data that was originally collected for another purpose, it may not necessarily line up with our own research objectives. So again, not all of these things are going to apply, but this is where it's up to you and your knowledge of research methods to talk about what's actually going to apply here. Okay, so let's see how this actually plays out. I have, once again, the Baker and Wolfer crime triangle article. And sometimes in an academic journal article, they'll actually tell you the limitations to their study. Other times they don't tell you at all. And even if they do tell you the limitations, chances are they're not going to mention all of them. And so again, this is where your knowledge of methods is so crucial, because you can pick out limitations that the authors may not necessarily tell you about. So let's see, study limitations. Okay. Well, this study is important in that it's a systematic, theoretical, and methodologically based evaluation of target-oriented and community-oriented policing. There are some limitations. All right, so let's see. First, this quasi-experiment was not pure in that there was some spillover in the policing practices between the target and control group. For example, even though residents from the control group are most likely to use the park, the crime hotspot, those who are in the general borough population may also use the park and see the new policing strategies implemented there. This is likely to affect the borough population's sense of safety as well. So it sounds like they have some potentially some spillover effects here because they did a quasi-experiment. So this could be a threat to internal validity. Secondly, while the sample sizes in the target and control group are large enough for statistical analyses, they're still relatively small. So this is a straight up statistical conclusion validity problem. So basically they've got a small sample size. Thirdly, as described previously, the local police department implemented many different COP strategies. Discerning how well individual tactics work independently of the other tactics is difficult. So this is a measurement validity problem, specifically a construct validity problem. So and this is an issue anytime you have a treatment that is multifaceted. So if you have, for instance, a problem-oriented policing strategy, problem-oriented policing can encompass many different things, right? So, problem-oriented policing is very specific, tailored to the problem that they were studying. So, you may have 9 different strategies that are implemented here, and it becomes very difficult to tease out exactly which strategy had an impact on crime. Lastly, the target and control groups are not completely equivalent regarding age, education, or gender differences. This may limit the generalizability of these findings to other locations and prompt a cautious interpretation of these findings. However, these are common risks when studying issues like policing and when quasi-experimental, non-laboratory real-life designs. Okay, so basically this is just a generalizability problem. So they're saying that the findings of their study, because it's done in this one location, may not be generalizable to other areas. So this is just a straight up external validity problem, but we tend to see this anytime we do experiments, specifically in the real world or non-laboratory, as they say. So again, they tell us about some limitations, but you'll always want to consider whether or not there are other limitations to the study. And you can critique a study by, going over, as I mentioned, these various areas. So consider nomothetic causality, consider your validity threats, and then consider weaknesses and how they collected data. So that pretty much wraps it up for critiquing academic literature. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. You can shoot me an email, contact me on Canvas, or leave a comment here on YouTube. And thanks for your attention.